Last year's tournament saw an average TV viewership of just 630,000, which since 2016 has nearly halved. That is an astonishing drop-off, not seen in any other sport. And with the current TV rights deal expiring in 12 months, Channel 7 is keen to offload the product after 3 straight years of declining viewership. The MCG recorded its lowest ever BBL crowd with 5,500 people. The league is shot, and it leaves a lot of people wondering why.
The latest wave of COVID is upon us. Cases are up more than 60% in Victoria and 40% in New South Wales, and infections in Queensland have doubled in the past week.
The fact that there was a global emergency lasting 2.5 years that had impacts on sport not seen since World War II didn't help. International talent found it almost impossible to get out here because of the border closures, and having no crowds was almost the end. It was quickly realised that the crowds at BBL games was much part of the TV spectacle as there were a profit through ticket purchase. Having this explosive, colourful product being played out in soulless, empty, grey stadiums was seriously uninspiring and served to dampen the TV coverage almost entirely. This, coupled with the fact that teams were having to call up local grade cricketers to fill spots because no overseas players could get in the country, meant the on-field performances were tough to watch. It felt like a failed TV show spin-off. All the money, with none of the soul, characters, or decent writing. But it's very easy to blame the uncontrollable for the drop of a sport, when in reality the BBL had been falling away prior to the arrival of COVID-19. In fact, the pandemic was effectively just the straw that broke the camel's back, because there were a few other things that have led Cricket Australia to conduct a review regarding the state of the Big Bash. The largest thing that is consistently pointed to as being the fall of the comp is the length of the season, as the appetite of the TV networks ironically led to its fall. In the first iteration of the Big Bash, there were 7 games per team. Each team played each other once. That was it, just once. This meant that the ladder positioning was stacked, and the weight placed on every single game was massive. The competition effectively stretched for a single month, with teams typically only playing once a week. In the 2020 to 2021 season, each team played 17 games, with the fixture more than doubling. This made for a cluttered schedule, placing some games at horrific 5 PM time slots on weekdays, meaning no one would turn up. It meant the season was longer, there was less time between games for star players to recover from injury, rendering squads at half strength for massive games. They increased the final series to include 5th place and a 5-game series instead of the traditional 3, meaning season wins became less and less important, meaning players were rested, interest waned. Not to mention the fact that longer seasons meant more interruption from international cricket and less availability of international level talent.
I mean, Brad Hogg didn't miss. He was pretty critical of Nathan Coulter-Nile and Marcus for going home for Christmas and missing out on a Boxing Day match. What is that criticism unfair?
Yeah, I think it is. I've done it before. It's a long season. Guys are trying to look after themselves, particularly guys like Coulter and Soin who have had issues with their bodies and they're trying to fly 4 hours to see family and 4 hours back to play game the next day. So the Stars have been very supportive for a long time about managing guys around that. I'm not sure what Hoggy has said, but
in some cases, less really is more. And Cricket Australia fumbled hard when it came to monitoring a successful product. The greed and hunger for more cricket and more revenue resulted in the league shooting itself in the foot, with many international players suggesting that they would never want to play in the BBL again, despite having competed previously. And the cricket is worse, not just the audiences. The last 3 BBL finals have finished uncompetitive, with the chasing side falling short by a considerable margin, leaving an unentertaining second half of cricket far removed from the excitement of finals gone by. And instead of real overhaul, the league's answer has been to introduce a host of rule changes to try and spice up the contest. The bash boost point, which has now been abolished, was used to incentivise teams to go big in the first 10 overs to win an extra competition point. In reality, all it did is lead to batting collapses from teams attempting to salvage a point out of an otherwise forgone game. Although the power surge is a clever inclusion, the rest of these rules, including the also abolished X-Factor substitution, have done nothing except regress the game's progress as teams attempt to adapt around them. Another not so talked about issue with the game is the elements that compose big leagues that differ from sport to sport. Similar to big soccer leagues, franchise cricket is very flash in the pan, because no single league has a monopoly over all the talent like the NBA, NFL or AFL do. Hence, there is no draft, and the players are free to sign with whatever club they like. With these players signing contracts all over the world in order to grab whatever cash they can, there is absolutely no incentive to sign multi-year deals, and there is no grassroots building of these teams. So what you end up with is rosters constantly changing from year to year because certain clubs have room to pay for certain players. There are players who break the mould: Moises Henriques, Glenn Maxwell, Aaron Finch. But for the international big draw cards, it's pretty easy to float from club to club based on who has the most cash to throw. Overseas players aren't invested in the city-to-city contests that fans identify with. The result of all this is it's very difficult to familiarise yourself and then blindly support a team when the players on that team completely change from one year to the next. It's not the same team, and it doesn't feel genuine. The BBL is fast losing the most important element of a good sporting competition: club-level supporters. In addition to this, the franchises that are able to retain their talent on loyal contracts have direct on-field success. The Perth Scorchers have been the most long-standing successful franchise the league has, and their core and culture has remained the same from 2011 to 2021. The bleeding of players has an impact both with the fans and with the performance. So, from the top of the sporting landscape and then forced into mediocrity, what do you do with a struggling competition? The issue with cricket is that the sport itself is difficult to market to the mainstream, so you need to go about presenting the BBL as an attractive package for anyone to watch. So how do they go about it so well in the first place? And how do you revive a dead product? The first thing to do is address the length of the season. Respected voices like Peter Siddle and Adam Zampa suggest it is way too long, while Ricky Ponting suggests that the amount of games is fine, but it needs to be over a shorter duration. Some people say less games with a longer duration. What seems to be forgotten is that the BBL was attractive in the first place because it was a spectacle. At its core, it was fantastic television that was exciting, fresh, and fun. Dragging something like that out to be longer and with more volume is always going to hurt it, no matter what it is. The catch with shortening the season, of course, is that the TV revenue is going to be far less because there is less cricket to sell. This, in turn, will affect Cricket Australia's spend on grassroots, player salaries, and the spend on the sport in general. But CA needs to take a good hard look at what that trade-off really means, because the product is becoming far less profitable by the second. And soon enough, those TV rights will be worth far less than what they would be if they put measures in place to return the BBL to what it once was. And they would draw more international talent that would be inspired to take the money the BBL has to offer because it's not as a large chunk out of their year and it's less likely to clash with their international duties. This would also allow the Australian players typically dragged away for international duties to be able to play out the entire competition as they used to, rather than having 4 or 5 game stints. The next potential fix is to contractually promote loyalty amongst players and teams. The introduction of the international draft was a good idea, but more needs to be done. There need to be incentives for players to sign multi-year deals, thus allowing teams to have less roster turnover and allow fans to support the same looking team year after year, with player moves becoming a big deal and a media storm, rather than just an under-the-radar Tuesday morning article. If teams were able to pay a player an extension outside of the cap for every additional year they were able to retain them, players would invest more in that club to make it more habitable for themselves. Dan Christian has played for 4 of the 8 teams in the BBL within 7 years. If he was able to be paid higher percentages for sticking around, it would encourage him and others to retain their place on teams and contribute to that history and lore that made such a young competition so attractive at the start. Along the line of contracts, the idea has been floated that those players with Cricket Australia contracts should be able to be paid outside of the cap in exclusive match payments with their BBL clubs. Because right now, clubs are spending good money in their cap on test players that won't suit up at all. The Adelaide Strikers have plenty of their salary cap tied up in Alex Carey and Travis Head, despite the assumption that neither will play a game this season. This money could potentially be used to pick up big-name internationals or strengthen domestic contracts. Other players like Usman Khawaja have called on the necessity of privatisation to improve the stocks of the league. Private ownership goes against the unspoken code of Australian sport, but rich private investors could have the necessary funds to strengthen the contracts and motivate offshore imports. Ben Pobji put it best in his Sydney Morning Herald article about how to fix the Big Bash when he said that what brings people to sport is the sense that the contest matters. When 80,000 people rocked up to the G, it was because they cared about the rivalry between the Stars and the Renegades. The tribalism of supporting one team over another is pivotal in the health of a sport. Without that, it's just a cricket-themed circus show. Embrace the rivalries, the dynasties, and the emotion. The BBL went from being a money-churning showcase to a legitimately adored sport. And without serious reinvention, it runs a very dark risk of returning from which it came.